I signed a contract to pretend I loved him, not to become his wife. Lily Carter kept her voice steady, even though her fingers trembled slightly against the edge of the polished mahogany table, the weight of the moment pressing down on her chest as she sat across from Ethan Cole, a man who looked like he had never once hesitated in his life, his tailored navy suit flawless, his posture relaxed yet controlled, his eyes fixed on her with a calm intensity that made it impossible to look away for long. The office around them was silent except for the faint hum of the city 30 floors below, sunlight filtering through floor-to-ceiling glass and casting long shadows that made everything feel more permanent than it should. Lily glanced down at the contract in front of her, the pages thick, expensive, and impossibly precise, every line carefully written as if nothing here had been left to chance, and maybe it had not. $1 million. That number sat at the top like a promise and a warning at the same time. Enough to pay off medical bills. Enough to secure her child's future. Enough to make her consider something she would have refused without a second thought just weeks ago. She swallowed slowly and lifted her chin, forcing herself to meet his gaze again. "This is just a public arrangement," she said, her tone firm, as if saying it out loud would make it easier to believe. Ethan didn't move immediately. He studied her for a moment, not in a way that felt invasive, but in a way that felt deliberate, as if he were measuring something beyond what she was saying. Then he nodded once. "It is exactly what it says," he replied, his voice low and even, the kind of voice that didn't need to rise to be heard. "You will appear as my fiancé." Nothing more. The words should have reassured her. They were simple, clear, controlled. But something in the way he said them made them feel less like a boundary, and more like a line that had already been crossed somewhere she couldn't yet see. Lily exhaled quietly and reached for the pen, the weight of it heavier than she expected, her reflection faintly visible in the glossy surface of the table, a reminder of the person she was about to become, even if only for a role. She hesitated for just a second, her thoughts flashing to her small apartment, to the quiet sound of her child breathing at night, to the stack of bills she couldn't ignore anymore, and then she signed. The ink dried almost instantly. It felt too fast for something that was supposed to change everything. Ethan slid the contract back toward himself without looking at it, as if her signature had never been in question. "You start tomorrow," he said, standing with smooth precision, already moving forward as if the decision had been made long before she walked into the room. Lily stood as well, her heart beating a little faster now, not from fear, but from something she couldn't quite name. As she turned to leave, the sunlight shifted, catching the edge of a document left partially visible on his desk, a thin folder with her name printed in clean black letters. She paused without meaning to, her eyes drawn to it for just a fraction of a second. It was not the contract she had signed. It was something else. Something official. Something stamped. The word marriage appeared clearly before she could stop herself from seeing it. Her breath caught just slightly. But enough. She didn't turn back. She didn't ask. Not yet. Because in that moment she understood something without needing it explained. She had agreed to pretend. But somewhere, in a place she hadn't been invited to see, the truth had already been written differently. Lily didn't sleep well that night, not because of fear, but because her mind refused to settle into something simple, replaying the moment in that office again and again, the sound of the pen against paper, the weight of the signature, and most of all the single word she hadn't been meant to see. Marriage. It lingered in her thoughts like a quiet echo she couldn't silence, and by the time morning light slipped through the thin curtains of her apartment, she was already awake, sitting on the edge of her bed, her phone resting in her hands as if it might hold answers it didn't yet reveal. The apartment was still. Her child was asleep in the next room, the soft rhythm of breathing grounding her in reality, reminding her why she had said yes in the first place. $1 million was not just a number. It was stability. It was relief. It was a future that didn't depend on hope alone. Lily stood slowly, moving through her morning routine with practiced efficiency. But there was a difference now. Every movement felt slightly sharper, more aware, as if she had stepped into something that required more than survival. It required attention. By 8 o'clock she was already outside, the air crisp against her skin as she walked toward her car, her phone buzzing softly in her hand. A message. From him. She hesitated for only a second before opening it. "Be ready at 9. Formal attire. My driver will pick you up." The message was brief, direct. It carried the same tone as everything about him. No unnecessary words. No explanation. Just expectation. Lily stared at the screen for a moment, then let out a slow breath, her fingers tightening slightly around the phone before she slipped it into her bag. She didn't respond. She didn't ask questions. Not yet. At exactly 9 o'clock, a black car pulled up in front of her building, polished to perfection, the kind of car that didn't belong on a street like hers. The driver stepped out without a word, opening the door with quiet professionalism. Lily paused for a fraction of a second before stepping inside, the leather seats cool and unfamiliar beneath her as the door closed softly behind her. The city moved past the window in a blur, familiar streets giving way to something more distant, more refined, until the car finally slowed in front of a building she had only ever seen in photographs. Glass. Steel. Precision. Everything about it reflected control. Inside, the air felt different. Cooler. Quieter. Controlled in a way that made every sound seem intentional. She was guided through the lobby without needing to speak, her reflection catching briefly in the mirrored surfaces around her, reminding her again that she was stepping into a role she didn't fully understand yet. When the elevator doors opened, Ethan was already there, standing near the far window, his posture exactly as she remembered, composed, deliberate, as if time moved differently around him. He turned when he heard her steps, his gaze settling on her not with surprise, but with quiet acknowledgement. "You are on time," he said, his voice steady, his eyes scanning her briefly before returning to meet hers. Lily stopped a few feet away, her expression calm, but her thoughts far from it. "I saw something yesterday," she said, not easing into the conversation, not softening the question, her voice clear despite the tension she felt building beneath it. Ethan didn't respond immediately. He watched her, his silence not dismissive, but measured, as if he had expected this moment to arrive sooner or later. "A document," she continued, her gaze steady, refusing to look away. "It had my name on it." The space between them felt smaller now, not physically, but emotionally, charged with something that hadn't been there before. Ethan took a slow step forward, not closing the distance completely, but enough to shift the balance of the room. "And what do you think you saw?" he asked, his tone unchanged, calm in a way that made it harder to read. Lily held his gaze, her breath steady now, her uncertainty narrowing into something sharper. "I think," she said quietly, "this is more than a contract." The words settled between them, heavy and undeniable, and for the first time since she had walked into his world, the line between what was real and what was arranged no longer felt clear. Lily couldn't quite shake the feeling that she had crossed a line. The city outside the sleek windows of the penthouse apartment looked as impersonal as ever, the hum of the busy streets below seeming far away. The elevator doors had barely closed before the air between her and Ethan had thickened with unspoken tension. He stood across from her now, his hands casually tucked into his pockets, his presence filling the space in a way she couldn't ignore. She had arrived, dressed as instructed, in the formal attire that made her feel like an outsider in a world she didn't belong to. The dress hugged her figure, elegant but uncomfortable, as though it was too much of an effort to maintain the image that Ethan expected of her. Ethan didn't say anything at first. His gaze flickered briefly over her, as if making sure every detail was in place. She was on time. She had followed the rules. Yet the question still lingered. Why was she here? What exactly did she expect out of this arrangement? His voice broke the silence, steady and unwavering. "Do you think you understand what you've signed up for, Lily?" Lily was quiet for a moment, her mind racing, her fingers tightening around the fabric of her dress. This wasn't just about money anymore. The weight of what she had agreed to began to settle on her shoulders, heavier than any amount of cash could ever be. "I think I understand what you want," she replied, her tone even but filled with a quiet edge. "But I don't know if I understand what you expect from me." Ethan smiled slightly, a knowing glint in his eyes. "Maybe you'll learn soon enough." Lily took a slow breath, unsure of where this conversation was going. She had made the choice, agreed to the terms, and yet something about the way he said those words made her feel as if she was already losing control. She was playing a part in his game, but she wasn't sure of the rules. "Why me?" she asked before she could stop herself. The question had been sitting on the tip of her tongue for days now. But now that she finally had the chance to ask, it felt almost reckless. Ethan paused for a beat, his gaze sharpening. He took a step closer to her, the space between them closing. But he didn't touch her. "Because you're the perfect person for the job," he said, his voice low but steady. "You don't need to be anything other than yourself, Lily." The words felt hollow somehow. He had made it clear this wasn't about love. This wasn't about finding someone to share his life with. It was a contract, a business arrangement, pure and simple. And yet, as she looked up into his eyes, she couldn't help but feel something more than just the cold exchange of words. Her heart raced as she tried to push the feeling away, reminding herself that she had made a choice. She would survive this. She had to. For herself. For her son. As if reading her mind, Ethan spoke again, his voice softer now, almost as if testing the waters. "I'm glad you're here, Lily. But remember, you're not just playing a role. This is real. And it can't end like any of the others." His words hung in the air, weighted with an unspoken promise she didn't know how to interpret. As she stood there, facing him, it wasn't the wealth, the status, or even the money that mattered anymore. It was the complexity of what lay ahead. What had she really gotten herself into? And more importantly, what was Ethan's game? The first time Lily stepped into his world in front of other people, she realized just how carefully constructed it was. The ballroom stretched wide under soft golden chandeliers, every detail polished, every movement measured, every conversation carrying a quiet layer of intention. She stood beside Ethan near the center of the room, her hand resting lightly against his arm, the contact subtle but deliberate, as if it had always belonged there, even though she could still feel the distance between who she was and the role she had agreed to play. Cameras flashed in controlled bursts, not chaotic, not intrusive, but present enough to remind her that this was not private. This was performance. Ethan leaned slightly toward her, his voice low enough that no one else could hear. "Stay close," he said, his tone calm, not demanding, but certain. Lily nodded once, her expression softening into something composed, something believable, the kind of smile that didn't reach too far into her eyes but stayed steady enough to pass unnoticed. People approached them one by one, each introduction brief, each handshake precise, each glance lingering just long enough to measure her, to place her, to decide what she meant in his life. She answered politely, her voice even, her posture straight. But inside she felt every second of it, the weight of being seen not as herself, but as someone attached to him. And then she noticed it. The shift. It was subtle, almost invisible, but real. The way people stopped questioning once Ethan placed his hand at the small of her back. The way conversations softened, respect settling into something immediate and unquestioned. Power didn't need to be spoken here. It was understood. She turned her head slightly, just enough to look at him, her eyes searching his expression for something that might explain the quiet control he carried so effortlessly. He didn't look back right away. His gaze remained on the room, steady, observant, as if he was tracking everything at once. When he finally met her eyes, there was no apology there. No explanation. Only certainty. "You are doing exactly what I need," he said quietly. The words should have felt transactional. They should have reminded her of the contract, of the agreement, of the boundaries she had drawn for herself. But they did not. Instead, they made something tighten in her chest, not because of what he said, but because of how easily she was fitting into it. The music shifted slightly in the background, soft and elegant, and without warning, Ethan turned toward her, his hand moving from her back to her hand with smooth precision. "Dance with me," he said, not as a question, but not as a command either. Lily hesitated for only a fraction of a second before allowing herself to be guided forward, her fingers settling into his, the contact warm, steady, impossible to ignore. They moved across the floor with quiet coordination. Not perfect, not rehearsed, but natural enough to feel convincing, his hand firm at her waist, hers resting lightly against his shoulder. The room seemed to fade at the edges, the noise softening, the movement around them blurring just enough to leave only the space between them in focus. "This is part of the act," she said under her breath, more to remind herself than to question him. Ethan's gaze didn't shift. "If that helps you," he replied. The answer was simple, but it carried something she couldn't fully define, something that made her pulse quicken just slightly, not out of fear, but out of awareness. As they moved, her eyes caught something across the room. A man watching. Not casually. Not politely. Intently. His gaze didn't move away when she noticed him, and for a moment, the warmth of the room felt colder, the illusion of control thinning at the edges. Lily's fingers tightened slightly against Ethan's shoulder, her focus breaking just enough to signal that something was wrong. Ethan followed the shift in her attention without asking, his expression changing in a way that was almost imperceptible, but enough for her to feel it. Not concern, not surprise, recognition. And in that quiet, unspoken exchange, Lily understood something else she hadn't been told. This was not just a performance. This was a world with rules she didn't know yet, and someone in that room was already testing them. The moment Lily stepped into the lavish penthouse, she felt like she was stepping into a world she didn't belong to. The space was grand yet sterile, with a sense of emptiness that only wealth could create. Ethan's presence filled the room, his tall frame and confident demeanor contrasting against the softness of the interior. She stood by the door, her heels clicking softly on the marble floor, trying not to feel like an intruder. He glanced over at her, a slight smirk on his lips as he saw her unease. "Don't worry," he said, his voice smooth. "You'll get used to it." His words didn't offer much comfort, but there was something in his eyes that made her hesitate before she walked further into the space. He was used to this life. She, on the other hand, wasn't even sure how to play the role he had assigned her. The contract was clear. Pretend to be his fiancée. But this wasn't just pretending. It was living in his world, surrounded by his rules, and performing every day in a way that felt more like survival than anything else. She hadn't expected it to be so much work. But then again, nothing in her life had ever come easy. The room was filled with people she didn't recognize, all of them looking at her as though they were assessing her worth. She kept her posture straight, smiled politely, and tried to hold her composure. But inside she was unraveling. "Lily," Ethan's voice called to her, snapping her out of her thoughts. He motioned for her to come closer, and though her heart raced, she obeyed. As she moved towards him, the crowd seemed to part, their gazes shifting to her as if she was suddenly the center of attention. She wasn't used to this. She had spent so many years living in the background, raising her son, making sure everything was in place. And now, here she was in the middle of a world where she had to be seen not for who she was, but for who she pretended to be. "This is the life you signed up for," she reminded herself quietly. But the words didn't feel like they belonged to her. They were hollow. Ethan took her arm, his touch surprisingly gentle despite the firm grip. "Come on, we're going to meet some important people," he said, leading her towards a group of business partners. His words were clipped, professional. She followed him without questioning. For a moment, she wondered if he saw her as just another part of his performance, a necessary accessory to his perfect image. But then she caught a glimpse of him looking at her, really looking at her, and for the briefest second she felt like she was more than just an act. He smiled. But it wasn't the calculated smile he had given to everyone else in the room. It was softer, more genuine. It was a glimpse of something real, something she hadn't expected to find. And in that moment, she wasn't sure if she wanted to run away or stay and see where this strange arrangement would lead. The night didn't end the way Lily expected it to. The event slowly dissolved into smaller conversations, quieter exchanges, and eventually silence. But the feeling it left behind didn't fade with the crowd. It followed her into the car, into the reflection of herself in the dark window, and into the stillness of Ethan's world when the doors closed behind them. The penthouse felt different now. Not because it had changed, but because she had. She walked a few steps ahead this time, her heels softer against the floor, her posture no longer shaped by the eyes of others, but by the thoughts she could no longer ignore. Ethan removed his jacket with the same measured calm, placing it over the back of a chair as if everything that had happened was just another part of his routine. Lily turned to face him, her arms crossing loosely, not defensive, but steady, her gaze clear. "That man at the event," she said, her voice quiet but direct. "He wasn't just watching." Ethan didn't deny it. He didn't pretend not to understand. He simply looked at her, his expression unreadable for a moment longer than usual, before he nodded once. "No," he said. He was not. The honesty landed heavier than any explanation could have. Lily took a slow breath, her chest rising and falling as she stepped closer, closing the distance not out of trust, but out of determination. "Then I need to know what I walked into," she said. There was no fear in her voice now, only clarity. Ethan studied her again. But this time there was something different in the way he looked at her. Not just observation, consideration. He moved past her toward the desk near the window, opening a drawer and pulling out a thin folder, the same kind she had seen before, the same quiet reminder that there were layers she hadn't been shown. He placed it on the table between them. "You were not chosen randomly," he said, his tone even controlled, but no longer distant. Lily didn't reach for the folder immediately. Her eyes stayed on his face, waiting, pushing for more than just fragments. Ethan held her gaze for a second longer, then continued. "There are people who would benefit from seeing me vulnerable," he said. "Attached. Predictable." The words were precise, carefully chosen. Lily felt something shift again, not in the room, but in the understanding she was building piece by piece. "So I'm a shield," she said quietly. Ethan didn't answer right away. He walked back toward her, stopping just within reach, not touching, but close enough that the space between them felt intentional. "You are part of the narrative," he replied. It was not the same thing. Lily heard the difference. She finally reached for the folder, opening it slowly, her fingers steady even as her thoughts moved faster now. Inside were documents she recognized in form but not in meaning. Reports. Names. Patterns. And there again her name. Not just on the contract, but connected to something larger. Something planned. She closed the folder gently, her hand resting on top of it for a moment as she absorbed what she had seen. "You built this before I agreed," she said. It was not a question. Ethan didn't deny it. "I prepared for every outcome," he said. Lily let out a quiet breath, not angry, not yet, but no longer untouched by the reality of it. She looked up at him, her eyes steady, searching for something that hadn't been written into any document. "And what happens if I walk away?" she asked. The question hung between them, simple on the surface, but carrying everything beneath it. Ethan's expression didn't change. Not immediately. But something in his gaze sharpened, not in control, but in truth. "Then it ends," he said. The answer was expected. Clean. Final. But he didn't step back. He didn't turn away. He stayed exactly where he was, as if the outcome was not as simple as the words suggested. Lily held his gaze for a moment longer, then nodded slowly, her hand still resting on the folder that had already rewritten more than she had agreed to. She understood now. This was not just a role, not just a contract. It was a structure built around her before she even knew she was part of it. And for the first time, the question was not whether she could survive it. It was whether she was willing to stay inside something she hadn't chosen fully. Lily stood by the window, her hand still trembling as she held the folder. The weight of the documents inside pressed heavily on her chest. She had come here thinking she understood everything, that she could control this. But now each word seemed to add another layer to a story she hadn't agreed to write. The idea that she was merely a pawn in someone else's game, even for the money she so desperately needed, made her question everything. Ethan had set all of this up before she'd even stepped foot into his life. He had planned every detail, every encounter, and now with the truth laid bare before her, Lily felt a mixture of betrayal and something deeper, something harder to define. She had agreed to this. No, she had believed she was agreeing to a simple job. A contract, a shield, a way to ensure her family was taken care of. But this was more. She felt her breath hitch as the reality of it all sunk in. Ethan had crafted a world for her. A place where she could play a part she hadn't even fully understood. A contract, after all, was only the beginning. The promises it made were one thing, the reality another entirely. Lily turned toward Ethan, who was still standing near the desk, watching her with that same unreadable expression. It was as if he had expected her to find the truth. And yet, here she was, left with the question of whether she could stay in this arrangement without losing herself. She walked slowly to him, her gaze locked on his. "Why didn't you tell me the whole story from the beginning?" she asked, her voice low but steady. Ethan's eyes softened for a brief moment. "I wanted to protect you," he said quietly. From all of this. From what it could do to you. The words felt like an apology, but there was no regret behind them. Not truly. Lily could hear the hidden layers beneath his voice, the control, the calculation. She had walked into a world designed for her, but not by her. For the first time since she had met him, Lily allowed herself to feel the full weight of what was happening. She wasn't just a shield. She wasn't just an actress in a story that didn't belong to her. She was a player in someone else's game, and for once she was going to make her own move. I need to know everything, Lily said, her voice finally breaking through the weight in her chest. She could feel the walls closing in, but this time she wasn't afraid. She wasn't just playing by his rules anymore. She was rewriting them. Ethan nodded slowly, his eyes meeting hers with a seriousness she hadn't seen before. And you will, he said. When the time is right. Lily took a deep breath, feeling the world shift around her. She had a choice now. The contract, the situation, none of it was as clear as it had seemed. But there was one thing she was sure of. She wasn't going to be just a part of this story. She was going to make it hers. Lily didn't open the folder again that night. She left it where it was, resting on the edge of the table as if touching it again would pull her deeper into something she was not ready to face. Instead, she stepped back, one slow step at a time, until the space between her and Ethan felt wide enough for her to breathe again. The city lights reflected across the glass behind him, outlining his silhouette in quiet gold, making him look distant even though he hadn't moved at all. You said I could walk away, she said, her voice steady now, not raised, not emotional, just clear in a way that surprised even her. Ethan didn't answer immediately. He watched her, his gaze sharper than before, not because he didn't understand the question, but because he understood it too well. You can, he said finally. The words were simple, clean, but they didn't carry the same certainty they had earlier. Lily nodded once as if accepting that answer, but she didn't move toward the door. Not yet. Her hands rested loosely at her sides, her shoulders squared, her posture no longer uncertain. Then I need you to hear this before I decide, she continued, her eyes meeting his without hesitation. I won't stay in something that was built without my choice. The silence that followed was different from the others. It was not controlled. It was not measured. It was real. Ethan took a slow breath, his jaw tightening just slightly, the first visible break in the control he carried so carefully. He stepped forward, closing the distance by half, not enough to corner her, but enough to make the moment impossible to ignore. It was never meant to take your choice away, he said, his voice lower now, less distant, more grounded in something she could feel. Lily didn't look away. Then why does it feel like it already has? She asked. The question landed harder than anything else she had said. For a moment Ethan had no immediate answer. He looked at her, really looked at her, as if seeing her not as part of a plan, not as a solution, but as a person standing in front of him demanding truth. When he spoke again, the control was still there, but something underneath it had shifted. Because I didn't expect you to matter this much, he said. The words were quiet, but they carried weight. Not polished, not calculated. Just honest enough to break through the structure he had built around himself. Lily felt it. Not as reassurance. Not as comfort. But as something real. And that made it harder, not easier. She let out a slow breath, her chest rising and falling as she processed what he had said, the tension inside her no longer sharp, but heavy, layered with something she couldn't dismiss anymore. You built this like a strategy, she said softly. But I'm not one. Ethan didn't argue. He didn't correct her. He simply stood there, his gaze steady, his silence no longer protective, but exposed. The city outside continued moving, lights shifting, cars passing. A world that had nothing to do with the decision being made inside that room. Lily glanced once toward the door, then back at him, the moment stretching just long enough to make the choice feel real. I am not leaving tonight, she said finally. The words were calm, but deliberate. Ethan didn't move. But something in his expression changed, not relief, not victory, but something quieter. But I'm not staying because of the contract, she added, her voice firm now. I am staying because I need the truth. All of it. The air between them settled, not lighter, not easier, but clearer. For the first time since she had signed her name, Lily was not reacting to what he had built. She was defining her place inside it. And for the first time, Ethan didn't try to control the direction of what came next. Lily stood by the window, staring out into the busy cityscape. The noise of the world outside seemed so distant, so irrelevant now. It had been hours since the conversation with Ethan. But her mind refused to let go of the words they had shared. She didn't want to admit it, but they had left her unsettled in ways she didn't expect. The weight of his admission, the honesty in his voice, she couldn't stop thinking about it. Maybe I was wrong, she murmured to herself, her voice barely audible over the hum of the city below. The thought lingered in her mind, but she quickly pushed it away. She couldn't afford to let her emotions take over. Not again. A soft knock on the door broke her reverie. She turned to find Ethan standing there, his posture more relaxed than she had seen it before. His usual cold, calculating demeanor was replaced by something softer, more human. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice carrying a trace of uncertainty that she hadn't heard in him before. Lily nodded, motioning for him to come in. He stepped forward, closing the door behind him. There was an awkwardness between them now, a tension that hadn't been there before. But it wasn't a bad tension. It was uncertain. She could feel his presence in the room, the weight of his gaze as he waited for her to speak. "I don't know what I expected," she said finally, breaking the silence. "I thought this was just another deal. A way to get ahead, to survive." She paused, her words heavy with the truth she had been avoiding. "But now, I don't know. You've changed everything. And I can't ignore it anymore." Ethan took a step closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "I didn't want to change anything. I just wanted something real," he said softly, the sincerity in his voice taking her off guard. Lily swallowed hard. The words she had been holding back for so long seemed to come rushing out now. "I never wanted this. I never wanted to get caught in your world, in your game. But you made me see things differently." Her voice wavered slightly, betraying the emotion she had kept bottled up. He reached out, gently taking her hand in his. It was a simple gesture, but it carried weight she hadn't expected. "You don't have to be in my world, Lily," he said, his voice low and steady. "But I can't promise you that I'll stop trying to make you see that maybe we don't need the game to be happy." For the first time, Lily felt something shift in the air between them. It wasn't just words anymore. It wasn't just a contract. It was real. He was real. She could see it now, in the way he looked at her, in the way he spoke. Lily didn't pull away. Instead, she let herself stand there, her hand still in his, her heart beating a little faster than before. She didn't know where this path would lead, but for the first time she was willing to take the first step. "I'm not ready to make promises," she whispered, her eyes never leaving his. "But I'm willing to see where this goes." Ethan gave her a small, relieved smile. "That's all I need," he said. And in that moment, they both knew that no matter what happened next, things between them had already changed.